Assalamu alaikum and good evening if you are tuning in from this part of the world, good afternoon if you're in Europe, and good morning if you are tuning in from the Americas. My name is Zishan Salahuddin and I lead the Center for Regional and Global Connectivity at Tabadlab. A very warm welcome to all of you to our latest Tabadlab Policy Roundtable, or TPR. And our topic for today is very pertinent and very important because it speaks about the stall in the negotiations between the Tehreek-i-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP, and the government of Pakistan, the GOP, and what kind of implications that has for national and regional security, as well as what kind of impact that has had preceding or afterwards in the relationship between the interim Taliban government, or the IEA, as well as the GOP. There's quite a bit of background to all of this. These negotiations began towards the end of last year, but they were officially confirmed in May of this year. In April of this year, the Pakistani state was quite frustrated with a lack of action on part of the IEA to bring the TTP to bear and to the table. And these negotiations continued well into the summer. During these negotiations, one of the things that happened was that a ceasefire was reached between the GOP and the TTP. Traditionally, Pakistan's approach towards the TTP has always been that of containment and management, and not necessarily disarmament and disbandment. In June of this year, Tabadlab produced a first response to the TTP negotiations that specifically spoke about what should be Pakistan's top priorities as far as these negotiations are concerned, how a lot of these negotiations have happened before and failed, and where we can go next. We have a tremendous panel of experts today to speak about this issue, which I will introduce one by one. We have Mr. Mahmood Jan Babar, who is a veteran journalist. He has been working in the industry since 1996, and he has covered news on militancy, terrorism, health, elections, economy, you name it. Mahmood Jan Saab has done it. He's also interviewed and worked with some very high-profile individuals on both sides of the border, and has also covered international politics and diplomacy in the Middle East, in addition to being a contributor for the BBC, the Independent, Voice of America, and a range of other local and national channels. So welcome, Mahmood Saab. It's so nice to see you again. We also have with us Dr. Faiz Zaland. He is an assistant professor at Kabul University. Dr. Faiz Zaland is a Kabul-based political activist and commentator. He's also an assistant professor, and in that job, he teaches governance and public sector reform, as well as international security. So, Dr. Faiz, I'm very interested in how you perceive, the regional ramifications of everything that has happened so far. He has long engaged in the Afghan peace process, which is another aspect of this that I'm quite interested in sort of uncovering and unpacking. And holds an MD from Afghan Medical College and a master's degree in public policy analysis from Universitat Erfurt. Our third panelist for today is Dr. Amna Jadoon, assistant professor at Clemson University. Her research interests lie in the area of foreign policy, state and human security, economic statecraft, political violence, and terrorism. Dr. Jadoon, I don't think there could be a more heavier set of topics for a particular panelist to cover. I'm quite interested in seeing how you would view the situation. She is also a non-resident fellow at the Stimson Center and the International Center for Counterterrorism, and she writes extensively on issues pertaining to international security, counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, employing a combination of quantitative and qualitative tools. And the last thing is that she is also the author of two forthcoming books on the Islamic State's global provinces. That's going to be, I believe, by the Columbia University Press, and the Islamic State Khorasan. Prior to this, she was also an assistant professor at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and holds a PhD in political science from the University of Albany. Our fourth and final panelist for this evening is Ms. Ile Arshad. Ms. Ile is a former member of parliament in the previous government for the National Assembly of Afghanistan. She was also one of the former spokespersons for the then President Ashraf Ghani, who, as we all know, was no longer running the country as of August 15th of last year. She's also served as the chairperson of the Committee on Education, Higher Education, Cultural Affairs, Religious Affairs. Prior to becoming a parliamentarian, she was a gender advisor and executive assistant to the Minister of the Interior and Minister of Education in Pakistan. And interior and education, I think, are the two key areas that are now a very hot topic as far as Afghanistan is concerned. So thank you for joining us, Ile, and I'm very interested in seeing what you have to say about the whole situation. And it's also very, very nice to see you after, I think, a gap of about 2.5 years. It's good to see you. महमूद जान बाबर साहब, आई थिंक आई स्टार्ट विद यू. मेरा पहला जो सवाल होगा वो आप ही से होगा. हम जानते हैं कि वादी सवात में हमने एकदम से रिसर्जेंस देखी टीटीपी की, और इस रिसर्जेंस के तहत बहुत सारे प्रोटेस्ट्स भी हुए, लोग सड़कों पे निकले, उन्होंने नारेबाजी की, उन्होंने ये बात कही कि उनको ये चीज़ नामंजूर है. ज़ाहिरी बात है कि जिस किस्म की कत्लो गारत इस खित्ते में देखी गई है और जिस तरह से मकामी लोगों ने इस जुल्म सितम को सहा है, ये कोई बहुत अच्छी बात नहीं है कि वही लोग लेस हथियारों के साथ उसी इलाके में दोबारा पाए जाएं, क्योंकि इसके बहुत सारे मनफी असरात जो हैं वो मुरतब हो सकते हैं उनके ऊपर, जो कि हमने माजी में भी देखा है. खैबर पख्तूनख्वा और नॉर्थ बलूचिस्तान वो दो एरियाज़ हैं पाकिस्तान के जिन्होंने सबसे ज़्यादा जुल्म को सहा है उस पीरियड के दौरान जिस दौरान टीटीपी वहाँ पर सबसे ज़्यादा एक्टिव थी. मेरा सवाल आगे सबसे पहले आपसे ये कि थोड़ा सा हमारे लिए ज़रा कॉन्टेक्स्ट बिल्ड कीजिए, थोड़ा सा हमें ज़रा बताइए कि इस वक्त मौजूदा सूरत हाल क्या है, क्योंकि ख़बरों में तो ये चीज़ तकरीबन गायब ही हो गई है. इनफैक्ट अगर आजकल आप ख़बरें देखें तो आपको शायद ये भी ना लगे कि मुल्क में किसी पॉइंट पर सैलाब आया था. लेकिन ज़रूरी है कि हम थोड़ा सा बिल्ड करें कि इस वक्त वादी दीर में, वादी सवाद में, एडजॉइनिंग एरियाज़ में क्या सूरत हाल है, क्या टीटीपी वाकई वहाँ पे पाई जाती है. अगर हम न्यूज़ को फॉलो करते रहें तो उसमें तो बड़ा क्लियरली ये नज़र आ रहा है कि सिर्फ पिछले एक हफ्ते में 5 अटैक हुए हैं सिक्योरिटी फोर्सेस के ऊपर जिनकी जिम्मेदारी उनको कबूल की गई है. तो महमूद जान बाबर साहब, कुछ बेसिक ज़रा हमें प्लीज़ बताइए.
बहुत शुक्रिया. सबसे पहले हमारे मौजूद तमाम दोस्तों को अस्सलाम वालेकुम जो देख रहे हैं. मैं आपसे यही बात शेयर करना चाह रहा था कि जो सवात तक अगर बात है, जहाँ से सबसे पहले ये सिलसिला शुरू हुआ कि लोगों ने निकलना शुरू किया दीर और सवात. दीर जो है वो अफगानिस्तान के बिल्कुल एडजेसेंट था, तो इसलिए वहाँ पे जो पहला अटैक हुआ जो एमपीए पे और उसके साथियों पे, उसके बाद फिर जुलूस निकले और लोग निकलना शुरू हुए. उसके बाद लोगों ने फिर सवात में फिर तालिबान को देखा और इसकी कंफर्मेशन फिर हुकूमत ने भी की. लेकिन इस वक्त सूरत हाल ये है कि जिस तरह आपने कहा कि इस वक्त खबरों में ऐसा कुछ नजर नहीं आ रहा, क्योंकि जो लोग बहुत ज्यादा घबरा गए थे उनको शायद ये थोड़ा सा एहसास हो गया है कि वो जो तालिबान आए थे वो शायद वो ये देखने के लिए आए थे कि उनके आने से क्या फर्क पड़ रहा है, लोग कितने परेशान होते हैं या उनके लिए अभी कोई स्पेस है. उन्होंने आने से पहले एक स्ट्रेटेजी में एक चेंज भी लेके आए थे. अगर आपको मालूम हो, जब से पाकिस्तान में ये हमलों का सिलसिला शुरू हुआ है तो तालिबान हो या कोई भी ऐसे अस्करियत पसंद हो, तो उन्होंने एक काम किया है. उन्होंने ये काम किया है कि उन्होंने अभी तक पब्लिक को टारगेट नहीं किया, और वो शायद ये चाहते हैं कि लोग जो हैं तो इनके बारे में वो ज्यादा परेशान ना हो. तो इन्होंने अभी तक अपना टारगेट जो है वो सिक्योरिटी फोर्सेस को रखा है, लॉ एनफोर्समेंट एजेंसीज को रखा है, और उन लोगों को रखा है जो कि किसी ना किसी हवाले से हुकूमत के साथ, पाकिस्तान की हुकूमत के साथ उनकी कोई एफिलिएशन हो. तो इस वक्त तक जो हमले हुए हैं, आपको अगर अब सवात में भी हमले नजर आए हैं, तो आपको अमन लश्कर का सरबराह नजर आया था, उस पे हमला हुआ था, और डीएसपी पुलिस का, और इसके अलावा एक और दकोड़क में भी अगर एक अटैक हुआ था, तो उसमें भी इन्होंने ये कहा था कि चूंकि इस शख्स ने माजी में हमारे खिलाफ मुख्तलिफ जगहों पे ये इस्तेमाल हुआ था, तो इसलिए हमने इसको निशाना बनाया है. लेकिन अभी कुछ दिनों से मैं देख रहा हूँ कि वो पूरा का पूरा रीजन जहाँ पे ये पहले आए थे वहां पे खामोशी है, लोगों की परेशानी भी कम हुई है. जो लोग हर हमले के बाद सवात के निशात चौक की तरफ दौड़े पड़ते थे और वहां पे वो इकट्ठे होकर वहां पे जलसे जुलूस करते थे, और वो इस बात से इनकार कर रहे थे कि हम मजीद किसी ऐसी शख्स को यहाँ पे नहीं देखना चाहते जिसकी वजह से हमारी जिंदगी मुश्किल हो. मैं अपने देखने वालों के लिए ये थोड़ा सा बता दूं कि जब 2007 टू 2009 سوات میں جو کچھ ہوا تھا تو اس میں لڑکیوں کی تعلیم متاثر ہوئی تھی. مخالفین کو طالبان نے قبروں سے نکال کے ان کو ماری تھی. وہاں پہ ایسے چوک بن گئے تھے جیسا ایک خونی چوک تھا, جیسے گرین چوک کہتے ہیں اب بھی. تو وہاں پہ روزانہ 3-4 لاشیں پڑی ہوتی تھی. کاروبار مکمل طور بند ہو گیا تھا. 40 جو کہ ہوٹل ایسوسی ایشن کے ساتھ جو ان کی تھی اس سے وابستہ تھے ہوٹل کے کاروبار کے ساتھ, وہ ختم ہو گیا تھا. وہ لڑکیوں کی تعلیم بھی, آپ کو ملالہ یوسفزئی کا واقعہ بھی یاد ہوگا, تو وہ بھی سوات ہی میں پیش آیا تھا, جس کی وجہ سے آج وہ اس پوزیشن پہ ہے. اس کے علاوہ پھر آپ نے جو باقی علاقوں کا کہا, تو وہاں پہ بھی اس وقت سکیٹرڈ وہ ہو رہے ہیں, حملے ہو رہے ہیں, اور ایسی کوئی پہلی کی طرح ایمبوش نہیں ہو رہے کہ ایک بڑی پوزیشن ہو ان کے پاس, وہ سامنے آئے, وہ سامنے سے لڑیں, ایسا حملہ کریں کہ اس میں وہ نظر بھی آئے. ابھی تک نہیں ہے خیبر پختونخوا میں, اور اس کی بڑی جو کامیابی کی بڑی وجہ یہ ہے کہ اس وقت پبلک سپورٹ کہیں پہ بھی ان کو نظر نہیں آ رہی. مجھے تو نظر نہیں آ رہی کہ کہیں پہ ان کے لیے پبلک سپورٹ موجود ہو. ماضی میں جب انہوں نے سوات میں یہ کیا تھا تو ان کے پاس یہ جسٹیفیکیشن تھی کہ ہم نے چونکہ اسلام آباد میں لال مسجد میں حکومت نے کوئی کارروائی کی تھی تو اس کی وجہ سے ہم یہ کر رہے ہیں. پھر وہاں کے لوگوں نے شریعت کا نظام بھی مانگا تھا, تو اس شریعت کے لیے بھی وہ انہیں سپورٹ کرتے تھے, لوگ ان کو نقد پیسے بھی دیتے تھے. باقی علاقوں میں بھی سب سے جو زیادہ کردار ادا کیا تھا, جو ان کو سپورٹ حاصل ہوئی تھی, اس کی وجہ یہ تھی کہ لوگوں کو انصاف چاہیے تھا, اور وہ انصاف جو ہے ان کے مختلف کیسز میں ان کو یہ لوگ آ کے وہاں پہ بیٹھ کے اپنے جرگے بنا کے وہاں پہ پنچایتیں لگا کے, اور وہاں پہ جو ان کے وہ بنتے تھے, عدالتیں لگتی تھی, اس میں لوگوں کے لیے جلدی جلدی فیصلے کر لیتے تھے, جو کہ ایک ایسی اٹریکشن تھی لوگوں کے لیے جس کی وجہ سے وہ انہیں سپورٹ کرتے تھے. اس کے بعد جب یہ سب کچھ ہوا تو اب اگر کوئی نیا فیز آ رہا ہے تو اس میں دو چیزیں بہت زیادہ امپورٹنٹ, ایک پبلک سپورٹ, ایک بات یہ کہ ان کی ویزیبلٹی اب بڑھ گئی ہے. ویزیبلٹی کسی کی بھی اس وقت اتنی آسان ہے کہ آپ انہیں دیکھنا چاہیں تو کسی کے پاس موبائل ہو, وہ کہیں دور سے بھی اس کی ویڈیو بنا کے وہ شیئر کر دے, تو وہ شخص مزید وہاں پہ چھپا نہیں رہ سکتا. تو اس وقت جو حملے ہو رہے ہیں وہ ٹی ٹی پی یہ کوشش کر رہی ہے کہ وہ اس کی پریزنس شو ہو, وہ اپنے بارے میں بتائے کہ وہ ابھی زندہ ہے. اگر وہ افغانستان چلی گئی تھی لیکن وہ ابھی بھی موجود ہے اور وہ حملے کرنے کی پوزیشن میں بھی ہے. وہ تو آپ کو پتا ہے کہ یہ دنیا کی کوئی بھی طاقت اسے کنٹرول نہیں کر سکتی جو خفیہ حملے ہوتے ہیں, تو یہی اس وقت بھی ہو رہا ہے. لیکن ہاں, جو میں نے آپ کو بتایا سوات سے وہ جو خطرہ تھا, وہ جو نظر آ رہا تھا جس کی وجہ سے لوگ پریشان تھے, اس میں کافی کمی آئی ہے. دیر کے علاقے میں بھی جو لوگوں نے کہا تھا خود ملتے گے ان سے, وہ بھی وہاں پہ بھی کمی آئی ہے. ہاں, یہ شفٹ ہوا ہے باقی علاقوں میں. میں دیکھتا ہوں پشاور کے ارد گرد کے علاقوں میں کہیں نہ کہیں کوئی ایکٹیویٹی ہو رہی ہے, وہاں پہ بھی آپریشن ہوا, اب وہاں سے بھی خبریں نہیں آ رہی. اب باقی جو ایریاز ہیں وزیرستان وغیرہ, وہاں پہ بھی حملے ہو رہے ہیں, لیکن میں نے آپ کو جیسے بتایا کہ یہ حملے ویسے نہیں ہیں کہ کہیں پہ بھی آپ کھل کے سامنے آ جاؤ, سامنے سے لڑیں. تو یہ ایک ماضی اور آج میں یہ فرق ہے کہ ان کے لیے شاید قدم جمانا اتنا آسان نہیں ہے جتنا وہ پہلے ہوا کرتا تھا. یہ جو مذاکرات کا بھی عمل آپ نے دیکھا, مذاکرات بھی ابھی نہیں ہو رہے. اس وقت میں یہ کنفرم کر سکتا ہوں تمام تک سٹیک ہولڈرز کے ساتھ بات کرنے کے بعد کہ اس وقت مذاکرات کا عمل بالکل سسپینڈڈ ہے, معطل ہے. کہیں پہ کوئی مذاکرات پاکستان اور ٹی ٹی پی کے نہیں ہو رہے. اور دوسری بات جو آخر میں یہ کہنا چاہوں گا وہ یہ ہے کہ مجھے یہ فیل ہو رہا ہے ان لوگوں سے بات کرنے کے بعد کہ افغانستان میں جو اس وقت اسلامی عمارت اسلامی افغانستان ہے یا افغان طالبان ہیں یا جو بھی ہیں, ان کی طرف سے ٹی ٹی پی کے لیے جو سپورٹ ہے اس میں کافی کمی دیکھ رہا ہوں. جی,
بہت شکریہ. Thank you very much, Mahmood John sir. I think you raised some very important and pertinent points. Principal among them, the fact that the attacks by the TP have primarily targeted state apparatus as well as security forces. They are not directly attacking the public because they're also aware of the fact that the public has a lot of historic trauma from the events between 2007 and 2009. And the ubiquity of the internet as well as smart devices also ensures that they have to be very careful about their visibility, which is why we're not seeing large-scale massive attacks. We're just seeing hit-and-run tactics employed by these non-state, anti-state actors. Dr. Jadoon, I'll come to you, if you'll allow me. Let's speak a little bit about the leverage that Pakistan has been believed to have as far as the Afghan Taliban are concerned, and the leverage that certain factions within the Afghan Taliban are believed to have with the TTP. because the bringing together of the two sides on the table was also facilitated by Mr. Haqqani himself. And I guess my question to you here is, we heard Tom West very recently speak about how they don't necessarily need an interlocutor anymore between, to facilitate talks between them and the IEA. There's also something to be said about how, for a long time, the strategic depth question, which was applied to Pakistan, seems to now be applied to the TTP, given the demands that they've had. And so now that we know, and as Mahmood Babar Saab also said, that there's a stall in negotiations, does this indicate a failure of peace or any kind of a peaceful resolution in the region? And what are the strengths and weaknesses of the past approaches? What could have been done better? Is this even something that we should have considered at all, considering in the past that all negotiations and all ceasefires have summarily failed over time?
Thank you for your question. And once again, to participate in this very important conversation. That's a great question, and there are a lot of different pieces in there. But I think my position, at least on these negotiations, since they've started, and since we've heard bits and pieces of what's going on, my position has always been that it wasn't really a realistic solution, nor is it likely to result in prolonged peace and resolution, which is what we really need. We need a sustainable solution. And so given the divergent interests of all parties involved, it was never a realistic approach in any case. So firstly, the way these talks have unfolded right from the beginning, they did not instill much hope for confidence or for successful outcome. As Mr. Babar mentioned, general national sentiment, right, which just has been, for the most part, disregarded. There has been a lack of consultation with any major civil society actors, and there isn't really a clear plan as far as public knowledge is concerned. What are the steps for reintegration or de-radicalization? There is no clarity on what the end game here has been in Pakistan's approach. And now the second part of the equation is the Pakistani state doesn't really seem to have an upper hand at this moment in the whole process. The power dynamics have shifted since the US withdrawal and the Taliban takeover. They've shifted towards the TTP. And in this context, barring any major concessions from Pakistan, peace talks seem futile because the TTP, as I've mentioned before in my writings, it seems really unrelenting. It seems emboldened, and it may be in some ways stronger than it has been in the past. And even in those contexts, negotiations did not work out. So what is really making us think that the outcome here will be different, right? Especially because the TTP now is emboldened. And I think the most important part is it's willing to continue to fight. It has been signaling its intentions throughout its propaganda campaign, while also engaging in talks, while also engaging in violence. So I don't know if there is a chance that these talks, compared to previous ones, will be different. In the past, the TTP did not keep its word, and part of the problem is that the TTP is not as cohesive internally. So what is to say that if there are certain segments of the TTP which do engage in negotiations, we won't see splintering or the creation of more extreme factions. So I think what could have changed that this time was if the Afghan Taliban were really serious about facilitating some sort of a resolution between the TTP and Pakistan, and also convincing them to give up arms. But we know that this has not been the case. So I think Pakistan needs to figure out how to deal with the TTP given its current internal dynamics. And also, we have to keep in mind that negotiations in general require societal support, and they also require that both parties are at the point where they think violence is counterproductive. I don't think we're seeing that from the TTP's side.
Agreed, Dr. Jadoon. And I think the point that you made about how the TTP has a lot of internal fracturing going on, and I think a big reason for that is because multiple factions that had emerged after the very concerted military operations against them sort of coalesced in the last few years to form the structure that currently exists. But even within that, if you were to look at factions such as Hafiz Gul Bahadur's group, they've always been, the hardliners that don't necessarily believe in negotiation, and they believe in taking on the state to impose their version of what they believe is the righteous and the Islamic way of doing things. And I agree with you in that what is the plan? That plan has never really been made clear. The strategy almost always has been that of containment, of management. In many ways, I would even argue of buying time rather than having a sort of this end goal to push towards. Dr. Faiz Alan, if you'll allow me, I'll come to you. The interim Afghan government is very clearly and very obviously in violation of the Doha Agreement from multiple standpoints, whether that was the killing of al-Zawahiri or that is the facilitation of the talks between the TDP and the GOP. Meanwhile, the GOP has been talking and very recently also stated that all of these negotiations have been in accordance with the Constitution of Pakistan. So both sides are basically trying to maintain that this is, it's something that's kosher, it's something that needs to happen, irrespective of whether there is political or any other space there for us to be able to conduct that conversation. Now, this obviously implies, as was the case, and we saw all the way back in April with the airstrikes conducted by Pakistan inside Afghanistan, a deterioration of the relationship between the interim Afghan regime and the government of Pakistan, which at one point, and I'm of course speaking about very close to August 15th of last year, we thought that the situation would just improve. That has summarily been struck down, and it appears that we will simply not be on the same page regarding a lot of these issues. Having been in the center of this and having observed this from an international security lens, how do you see the relationship between the government of Pakistan and the interim Taliban regime unfolding over the next few months as these negotiations between the TDP and the GOP have failed? Dr. Faiz, are you still with us? I think Dr. Faiz may have dropped out or has a weaker connection. Yes, he's dropped out. I'll move on to my next question. Ile, if I may come to you while we wait for Dr. Faiz to join back in. You've been part of the Afghan government under the Ghani regime. You have led multiple portfolios within education, within interior, within health, within security. It seems to me at this point that the Taliban stance on, and I'm speaking about the Afghan Taliban, on a lot of these things is almost immovable, whether that is an inclusive government, whether that is girls' education, whether that is border security. And I guess my question to you is, given that the current setup is very much catering to the hardliners, the people that have been loyal to them for a very, very long time, and given your political background, how do we go about creating some of the, I guess, political space for us to be able to have these conversations and for us to be able to, bring the IAEA to bear upon some of its international obligations to move more towards the recognition issue, to move more towards regional integration? How do we create that political space? Sorry, Ile, I think your mic is still turned off.
I want to correct. Is that okay now? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Thanks for having me, and good afternoon to your distinguished guests and viewers. And I want to correct one part of my introduction. I was a spokesperson and member of a political committee of Dr. Ghani in 2014. And by the time they created the National Unity Government, I was part of opposition. And also for the past 5 years, I was a member of the peace talks, track 2, bilateral between Afghanistan and Pakistan. to see that the Taliban and their creation and their arrivals and suddenly capture of the government, there was a huge chaos in Afghanistan, and everyone could see it. But in regarding of their recognition and also the women right, we face terrible problems. Although there was some positive issues by the time Taliban took the power. For example, in Afghanistan, as we all know, we have major powers or warlords. They were not to control, and thank God Afghanistan got rid of them. But in regarding of women rights and girls' education, first of all, I think Taliban has forgotten totally that in Afghanistan we have more than 5 million. We lost more than 5 million people, and in each man who is lost from a family, of course, a woman, a mother, a wife, or a daughter suffered their loss. And if they say that women are not allowed to work, it means that we are ignoring a big majority of people in Afghanistan. And also education, the reasons they are giving, it's not appropriate and not acceptable for anyone. So as a politician or as a member of parliament, we are busy to negotiate and also to work hard on this issue. In regarding of the happening between the relation between Afghanistan and Pakistan, I think this was also part of your question, as it was broken down and I couldn't hear it properly. I think in the history of politics, it has been proven when a country creates a spy or a group for their national benefits, after a while, that group and that spy become the first enemy of the creators. So there is major issues going on, but what happened was now not under control, but we should think about the solution. And also, as your guest said, that we need a sustainable solution for bilateral nation-to-nation relation with Afghanistan and Pakistan, and also government to government. And it takes a long time. And although we had Afghan-Pakistan relation was not friendly for the past 50 years, but we had a very golden 20 years where we could fix that relation, especially nation to nation and government to government relation. Unfortunately, it didn't happen, and to see in my experiences in 5 years of peace negotiation under the track 2, I could just see a one-sided love story in the relation of Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Thank you, Ilay. And I think part of the reason that I've asked you the political space question is I think it's very important to discuss female representation as far as the current political setup in Afghanistan is concerned, because I think that is very deeply tied to how conversations between Pakistan and the interim Taliban government can actually take place. But in the absence of that, and in the presence of a very emboldened Afghan Taliban who have come back into power stronger than ever after 20 years of the war on terror, I think having that kind of space is very difficult, and having any kind of leverage, the question that I also posed to Dr. Jadoon, is kind of a fool's errand more than anything else. Dr. Faiz, you're back with us. I'm not sure if you heard the question that I had asked, but the central crux of my question was, given everything that has happened so far, and now given the stall in negotiations between the TTP and the government of Pakistan, how do you see the relationship between the IEA and the GOP unfolding over the next few months?
The question is, I think, referred to me.
Yes, Dr. Zalan, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. You can see I'm online from Kabul. The Wi-Fi and even my cell network coverage is not assisting me, but I will try my best to comment on the question. The Taliban, not only in the Pashtun belt and within the Pakistan, but I think in the region specifically for Afghans, it is very vital. I think presence of Taliban in the long term is something must existed, that we need to coexist with Taliban, and not only being in power, but being in political and also military.
I think we've lost Dr. Zaland again, unfortunately. Cellular reception and Wi-Fi connectivity in Kabul seems to be not where it needs to be in order for us to have some of these very important conversations. I'll pivot back to you, Dr. Jadoon. By and large, while there are multiple factions as far as the TTP is concerned, there's three broad sort of mindsets within there, right? The first one is the one that is very hardliner, that wants to fight, that wants to continue to create problems for the state of Pakistan. The second group is that which does not believe in laying down arms, but does believe in, conducting some form of negotiations so that some kind of space can be created for their fighters' families especially. And then there's the third group, which is just keen on returning home. They don't particularly at this point care about which way the cookie crumbles, but they're more interested in going back to their lands, going back to their towns and having their families resettled and no longer live the sort of nomadic existence that they have been, particularly in Khost and Kunar within Afghanistan. I guess my question to you is it possible to conduct part of the negotiations in a manner so that those that are at the very least willing to lay down their arms, or at the very least capitulate to some of the negotiated settlements, can be, disarmed, or at the very least no longer pose a threat to the Pakistani state or the Pakistani public in the long term? And connected to that is, how would you see the process of negotiations in the future unfolding? We've seen multiple times in the past, all the way back to 2008, 2009. We've tried to do these negotiations. We've had ceasefires. They're not successful. Is this even something that the state of Pakistan should consider, or is this a pipe dream that we should have given up a long time ago? And instead of following a policy of containment and management, we should instead really be looking at a policy of complete disbandment and disarmament.
Thank you, Zishan. Sorry, your voice got cut off in the second part of the question.
My question was, given all the negotiations and ceasefires that have happened in the past and how none of them have been successful, is it just a pipe dream to continue to pursue this option, and instead we should really be focused more on disbandment and disarmament by any means necessary?
That. I think the point that you raised about identifying the different segments within the TTP is pertinent, and I think based on good intelligence that they are actually willing to give up arms and they are just tired of fighting, then I think it could be fruitful to have a program or some sort of a mechanism at the state level which allows the peaceful return of these individuals, right? Again, but this will have to be a well-developed system which does not falter, because the risks of faltering when it comes to integrating or reintegrating former militants is a high-risk one, right? So I think we will have to manage that very carefully. Given what has happened in general in Pakistan whenever we've tried to negotiate with the TTP, I don't think there is any quick resolution to this problem, right? Because any sustainable, meaningful solution for peace has to address the underlying causes. Therefore, it has to be long-term. So, as I've mentioned before, the TTP right now are feeling strong and emboldened. And for the most part, the most vocal part of the group is seeking autonomy in its prior strongholds, right? And the risk now isn't just that the TTP will merge into groups like ISA, but that it will start leveraging links with its old allies, which can overall exacerbate terrorism and coercion of civilians within the country. So if you look at TTP's latest messaging, there is no quick solution to this, right? Because they're talking about amendments to the Pakistani constitution, they criticize its legislation, they showcase some of their attacks on Pakistan. So they're really, where is really the message which is showing us that these negotiations can be fruitful, right? So keeping the above in mind, I think Pakistan's only option really is to take counterterrorism along with counter-extremism more seriously, conduct intelligence-based operations, and align its kinetic and non-kinetic approaches, while also moving away from proxy warfare and leaning into building genuine economic relationships with its neighbors. We've heard a lot of talk on, the shift away from geopolitics towards geoeconomics, and I think now we have a real opportunity because a stable Afghanistan, which is thriving in the economic realm, actually aligns with at least some interests of all the major players in the region, right? And I think another important thing that the Pakistani state really needs to focus on, especially building on the momentum that we see in the country, right? There's really not an appetite to make the TTP, which has inflicted so much terror on the civilians of Pakistan and also caused economic damage and to the social fabric of Pakistan. So Pakistan really needs to figure out how to capitalize on this and delegitimize the TTP's extremist views and their messaging. So given its own dynamics, what is the best course of action to assure sustainable peace, right? Is it segmenting the TTP and developing a mechanism to allow a slow trickle back and factors which are important to get us there, right? Are there any actual real points that the TTP will compromise on? Do we have good intelligence on that? And ultimately, the TTP wasn't created overnight, and it's a product of a lot of different factors. A lot of them are based on the policies that the Pakistani state have adopted over decades. So TTP wasn't created overnight, and I think it won't be resolved overnight, but I think we need to develop a sustained approach which incorporates element of our kinetic tactics, but also our non-kinetic approach.
Thank you, Dr. Jadoon. I think those are very, very valid points, particularly about how if some of these past links are revived with certain groups within Pakistan, that could spell a lot of trouble. And the bulk of the security conversation around this entire topic, for a very long time, we've been viewed through a security lens. We've been viewed as, the frontline ally in the war on terror, or somebody that is just facilitating the West and whatnot. Our national security policy, the first one of its kind that was released under the leadership of Mr. Moeed Yusuf, Dr. Moeed Yusuf, earlier this year, puts geoeconomics and economic connectivity at the heart of the security policy of Pakistan. And I completely agree with you in that those economic relationships and the bolstering of those economic ties, cross-border trade, bolstering local economies, bolstering local communities, is one of the ways forward to build a better relationship, not just with the interim Taliban government, but also to try and delegitimize the activities of the TTP. Mahmood Jan Babar Sahab, I'll come to you just after Dr. Zalan, because he's back, and I'm hoping that perhaps this time around he'll be able to answer the question. Dr. Zalan, you already know the question. I'm just going to go straight to you.
Thank you so much again for having me. What Dr. Jadoon mentioned regarding the presence of Pakistani Taliban, especially from those policies which were made and passed by the government, and they were sloganed as a good and bad Taliban. I think this is the byproduct. But nowadays, Pakistani Taliban, they have been showing a lot of interest in their legitimization comes from the presence of Taliban government in Afghanistan. Like they take oath within the Amir of Afghan Taliban. They represent themselves as a part of being Afghan Taliban, while the recent mediation, the recent peace talks between Pakistan government and the Pakistani Taliban, which were mediated by Mr. Haqqani, who is the MOI minister for the Taliban government in Kabul, shows that there are some kind of brotherhood, some kind of links, but they all resist on the mutual interest of Taliban in the region. Having peace talks with Taliban, it may take long, and it may take some political and some security weight toward the government of Pakistan to integrate Pakistani Taliban in the state of Pakistan. Secondly, they see more tribal forces rather than religious forces on the Pashtun belt. The agencies that were Taliban are more active and they are more powerful. They are those agencies which were historically played an important role in the region. With the Anglo-Afghan wars, and then with the Britain's presence in the region. And then for past 7 decades since the inception of Pakistan, these agencies were never stable, they were never secured, they were somehow playing a buffer zone, and then playing a kind of unlawful areas where terrorist groups, Mujahideen during the Afghan Soviet war, and then after that when the Taliban were created, and then the Taliban were fighting the US NATO presence in Afghanistan, the occupation. These were the safe havens used by Afghan Taliban, supported by the local tribals. And the local tribals naming them or stereotyping them with the Pakistani Taliban, I think, again, is becoming a byproduct of all those policies that had taken place in past 2 decades from the state of Pakistan. Now, their reappearance in the region shows that these militant groups are having support in the region, having support indigenously, and having support from their historical perspective of being tribal forces to resist the state apparatus, not only on Pakistan side, but on Afghanistan side also. The current instability within Afghanistan, the current insecurity within the border area, it somehow supports their resistance against Pakistan government. Secondly, it is not only Pakistani Taliban, we see there are Baloch fighters also, which cultivate somehow the seeds of instability in the Pashtun belt, and it somehow assists Pakistani Taliban in their presence for empowering themselves for recruiting, and also for by having some safe havens in this area, which is porous and mountainous, difficult for state apparatus, security powers to somehow contain such forces, such guerrilla forces, or hit-and-run forces in the region. So more or less, I think Pakistan would need not only Afghan Taliban support, they would need to go for this new strategic change of their goal of stability, which Zishan, you rightly saying, like Dr. Mueed's approach regarding the geo-economic approach for security. If that is going to be implemented in coming months and years, in support with Afghan Taliban in power, it can bring the regional cohesion. Specifically, now we have Shanghai and the area, we have Central Asia and South Asia bridging themselves with the economic regional projects. China is there, One Belt, One Country, and the CPAC projects. It all can somehow help them to support the region with the geoeconomic, geostrategic approaches to not only contain such kind of instability, but such kind of forces for the long term.
Thank you, Dr. Zaland. Mehboob Jan Babar Sahab, I have a quick question for you. माजी में हमने देखा कि हथियार डालने के लिए ये लोग तैयार नहीं हैं. आई होप यू कैन हियर मी. बैकग्राउंड में थोड़ी सी अजान का थोड़ा सा शोर है. आई होप आपको मेरी आवाज़ आ रही है. जी. माजी में हमने देखा कि ये लोग हथियार डालने को तैयार नहीं हैं. हमने देखा कि ये डिसबैंड करने को तैयार नहीं है. मुकामी कुव्वतों ने बहुत सारे इस मसले के हल निकाले, लश्कर तश्कील दिए गए, बहुत सारी जरगास भी बैठी, लेकिन वो वक्त था कि जिस दौरान सिविलियंस को, जैसा कि आपने कहा, टारगेट किया जा रहा था. अब वो वक्त नहीं है. अब हल ये तो नहीं है, जिस तरह से आपने कहा कि जो हिट एंड रन टैक्टिक्स हैं, यानी गुरिल्ला वॉरफेयर जिसे कहते हैं, कि उसके तहत स्टेट को ये टारगेट करते रहें और मामला इसी तरह से आगे चलता रहे. आखिर इस पूरे मसले का हल क्या है? क्या लश्कर दोबारा तश्कील दिए जाने चाहिए? क्या स्टेट की तरफ से बेहतर इंटरवेंशन होनी चाहिए? क्या हमें इंटरिम अफगान तालिबान की जो हुकूमत है उस पर किसी तरह से प्रेशर डालना चाहिए कि इनके लिए जो इनकी जो फैसिलिटेशन है, जो इनकी ऑपरेशनलाइजेशन है, उसको किसी तरह से रोका जाए, महदूद किया जाए? क्या हल है इस पूरे मामले का?
मैंने जैसे आपको पहले भी बताया था कि इस वक्त जो चीज नजर आ रही है वो ये है कि अफगान हुकूमत या अफगान तालिबान इस वक्त टीटीपी की इतनी ज्यादा सपोर्ट नहीं कर रहे जितना यहाँ पे लोगों को खदशा था. और आप देखें कि जब से अब पाकिस्तान में कार्रवाइयां शुरू हुई तो उसके बाद भत्ते की काज शुरू हुई और लोगों से भत्ता मांगा जाने लगा. तो फिर पाकिस्तान ने जब इस बार शिकवा किया तो इस बार हमने देखा कि अफगानिस्तान की तरफ मौजूद जो कि पाकिस्तान के साथ उसके ईस्टर्न वो हैं प्रोविंसेस हैं, वहां पे बाज़ाब्ता तौर पे कार्रवाइयां की गई. उन लोगों को गिरफ्तार किया गया जिन पे ये शक था कि वो पाकिस्तान में काज करते हैं या पाकिस्तान जाके वहां पे कोई कार्रवाई करते हैं और उसके लिए यहाँ के अपना इन्फ्लुएंस इस्तेमाल करते हैं. तो मेरे ख्याल में एक बात तो बड़ी वाज़ेह है कि इस वक्त जो नेगोशिएशन करने वाले थे वो इस वक्त एक पाकिस्तान की साइड पे आ चुके हैं, वो पाकिस्तान ही की तरफ है. और आज ही मैंने इसके बारे में, जब से आपने मुझे ये इन्विटेशन दी थी, तो मैंने कोशिश की तमाम स्टेक होल्डर से बात की जाए. तो मैंने देखा कि इस वक्त जब ये पाकिस्तान और टीटीपी के मुज़ाकरात हो रहे थे तो क्या उस वक्त ये डिग्रेडेशन का जो आपने वर्ड इस्तेमाल किया, क्या पाकिस्तान और अफगानिस्तान के बीच ताल्लुकात इतने खराब थे या हैं? तो इसका जवाब मुझे पाकिस्तान की तरफ से अभी तक जो मालूमात मिली है कि जो हो रहा है दोनों मुल्कों के बीच, उसमें कोई इतनी बड़ी यानी परेशानी वाली कोई बात नहीं है. और अफगानिस्तान की तरफ भी जब मैंने ये बात मालूम करने की कोशिश की तो वहां से भी जो बातें मालूम हुई तो वो हौसला अफजा थी कि इस वक्त टीटीपी और पाकिस्तान आपस में एक दूसरे के साथ जो भी कुछ करें, लेकिन दोनों ममालिक एक दूसरे के साथ आगे जा रहे हैं. मैं थोड़ा सा आपको ये बताना चाहूँ कि इससे पहले माजी में हमने देखा था कि अफगानिस्तान तैयार नहीं होता था कि पाकिस्तान में उसके लोगों की ट्रेनिंग हो, लेकिन इस वक्त जो आज ही मैंने ये मालूमात हासिल की तो मुझे पता चला कि एक एमओयू होने जा रहा है कि इस वक्त अफगानिस्तान के जितने डॉक्टर हैं वो पाकिस्तान में एक पोस्ट ग्रेजुएशन के लिए यहाँ पे जो कॉलेज ऑफ सर्जन्स एंड फिजिशियंस है वहां पे वो आके अपनी ट्रेनिंग करेंगे. इसके अलावा कॉमर्स, बैंकिंग, रेलवे, सिविल एविएशन, अभी तक अफगानिस्तान की तरफ से ऐसी कोई रजामंदी इन मामला पहले नहीं हुआ करती थी. जो तिजारत के बारे में है तो जब ये टीटीपी और पाकिस्तान के मुज़ाकरात हो रहे थे तो तिजारत भी मेनी फोल्ड बढ़ी है और इस वक्त उसमें मुसलसल इजाफा हो रहा है. और ये जो सारे काम है तो इसमें जब मैं ये देखता हूँ तो इसमें एक चीज जो है वो बड़ी बहुत ज्यादा अहम है कि पाकिस्तान, अफगानिस्तान और उज़्बेकिस्तान की जो ट्रेन शुरू होने वाली है उससे एक बहुत बड़ा फर्क पड़ने वाला है. लेकिन एक बात ये वाज़ेह है कि वहां की हुकूमत ने अपने पुराने दोस्तों को मैसेज दे दिया है कि हमने मुल्क चलाना है, हमने अफगानिस्तान चलाना है, आप अगर पाकिस्तान के साथ लड़ेंगे तो एक तो वो, मैं अपने देखने वालों के लिए सिर्फ यहाँ पे एक बात करना चाहूंगा, अगर आप लोगों को याद हो तो दोहा मुआहदे के तहत अफगान तालिबान इस बात के पाबंद हैं कि उनकी सरजमीन किसी के खिलाफ इस्तेमाल नहीं होनी चाहिए. तो वो इसलिए भी पाकिस्तान के खिलाफ अपनी सरजमीन के इस्तेमाल होने पे इस वक्त नाराज लग रहे हैं. और जो हमें लग रहा था कि अगर पाकिस्तान और टीटीपी आपस में लड़ पड़ते हैं तो अफगान हुकूमत या अफगान तालिबान उनकी तरफ खड़े होंगे, तो ऐसा नहीं हुआ. जिसका ये बहुत ज्यादा फायदा हुआ है कि अभी तक जो मैंने आपको बताया कि इस वक्त अफगान तालिबान की हुकूमत ने पाकिस्तान से अभी भी ये मुतालबा किया है कि उसके स्टूडेंट्स کو مزید جو ہے اسکالرشپ ہیں وہ بڑھائے جائیں. ابھی یہ ڈاکٹر فیض صاحب اس کی تصدیق کریں گے, پاکستان کو یہ موصول ہوا ہے کہ 4,500 مزید اسکالرشپس وہ دے رہا ہے اس وقت. تو میرے کہنے کا مطلب یہ ہے کہ وہ جو ہم سوچ رہے تھے کہ افغان طالبان کی حکومت جو ہے وہ سائڈ لے گی کیونکہ ٹی ٹی پی نے امریکہ کے خلاف لڑنے میں ان کی مدد کی تھی, تو وہ ابھی تک نہیں ہوا. اور یہ جو مذاکرات جو معطل ہوئے تھے, اس سے پہلے مذاکرات شروع کیوں ہوئے تھے؟ آپ کو پتہ ہے پاکستان اور ٹی ٹی پی کے مذاکرات کیوں شروع ہوئے تھے؟ وہ اس لیے شروع ہوئے تھے کہ افغان طالبان نے پاکستان کو دوحہ میں یہ یقین دہانی کرائی تھی کہ جب ہمارے اور امریکہ کے مذاکرات کامیاب ہو جائیں گے اور ہم افغانستان چلے جائیں گے, افغانستان کو ٹیک اوور کر لیں گے, اس کے بعد پھر ہم آپ کی اور ٹی ٹی پی کے مابین بھی یہ بات چیت کرائیں گے تاکہ ہمیں دوحہ معاہدے پہ عمل درآمد کرنے میں بھی آسانی ہو, افغانستان کی سرزمین بھی کسی کے خلاف استعمال نہ ہو, اور ہم ٹی ٹی پی کو بھی ایک مشکل سے نکال لیں اور آپ کے ہاں بھی اگر کوئی مشکل بنتی ہے تو نکال لیں. تو اس لیے یہ جو مذاکرات پاکستان کے بیچ ہو رہے ہیں اور افغانستان کی طرف سے اگر اس میں کوئی ثالثی ہو رہی ہے, اس کی بڑی وجہ یہ تھی کہ وہاں پہ اس حوالے سے ایک معاہدہ ہوا تھا, ایک بات ہوئی تھی, جس کے بعد جیسے ہی وہ یہاں پہ آئے تو انہوں نے اس سلسلے کو شروع کیا, اور پچھلے ہی سال وہ آئے اور پچھلے ہی سال انہوں نے ان مذاکرات کو شروع کیا. ابھی جو دوست نے بات کی کہ کسی نے کہ پاکستان میں مذاکرات کا جو عمل ہے, آپ دیکھیں کہ سب سے پہلے جو مذاکرات کا عمل ہوا تھا پاکستانی فوج اور کمانڈر نیک محمد کے مابین ہوا تھا. جب امریکہ افغانستان آیا اور اس نے چیز کیا القاعدہ کو, اور القاعدہ کو اس نے پش کیا کہ وہ پاکستان کی طرف آئے, تو جیسے ہی وہ پاکستان میں آئے تو پاکستان میں انہوں نے ان کو جب دیکھا کہ مقامی لوگوں نے کہ امریکہ نے افغانستان پہ بھی حملہ کر دیا ہے اور اب ان کے پیچھے یہاں بھی آ رہے ہیں, ان کو مار رہے ہیں, تو وہاں پہ کمانڈر نیک محمد کے ساتھ پہلا معاہدہ ہوا. اس کے بعد جب کمانڈر نیک محمد کو ہی مذاکرات کے دوران مارا گیا, اور یہ ان لوگوں نے مارا جو کہ ان مذاکرات کے دشمن ہوا کرتے تھے. پھر بیت اللہ محسود جو ہے اس نے پھر مذاکرات کیے ان کے ساتھ, حکیم اللہ محسود بھی کے وقت میں بھی یہ سب کچھ ہوا, جو بھی آیا سب کے وقت میں یہ ہوا. اور آج کل یہ افغانستان میں یہ طالبان کیوں موجود ہیں؟ لوگ پوچھتے ہیں کہ پاکستان کا ٹی ٹی پی افغانستان میں کیوں موجود ہے. آپ کو یاد ہے نا کہ جب 15 جون 2014 کو آپریشن ضرب اسب شروع ہوا اور شمالی وزیرستان کو دنیا کی ڈیمانڈ پہ اور اپنے لیے ہم نے اس کو بالکل صاف کیا, اور یہاں سے جتنے بھی عسکری پسند تھے, انٹرنیشنل موومنٹ آف ازبکستان سے لے کے کسی بھی ملک کا آپ نام لے, القاعدہ, طالبان, سب لوگ افغانستان چلے گئے یا انہوں نے کسی اور طرف کا رخ کیا اور پاکستان ان سے خالی ہو گیا. تو اس وجہ سے ابھی جب ہم یہ دیکھتے ہیں کہ وہ افغانستان میں کیوں موجود ہیں, تو اس کی وجہ یہ ہے کہ اس وقت ان کا جب پیچھا کیا گیا تو انہوں نے افغانستان جانا پسند کیا, اور پھر انہوں نے امریکی جنگ میں, امریکہ کے خلاف جنگ میں تحریک-ی-طالبان پاکستان کو کیا. ابھی آپ نے یہ کہا کہ ایسا کیا سیناریو ہو سکتا ہے, میرا نہیں خیال کہ ایسی کوئی بات ہو سکتی ہے, کیونکہ مطالبات جو ہیں وہ بہت زیادہ سنگین ہیں اور ایسے ہیں کہ بہت شدید قسم کے مطالبات ہیں, ایسے ہیں کہ ان کو تسلیم کرنا, ان کو پورا کرنا کسی کے لیے ممکن نہیں. اب جو ٹی ٹی پی ہے وہ یہ چاہتی ہے کہ اس کے لیے فاٹا میں کوئی سابق فاٹا میں کوئی ایسا سپیس دیا جائے جہاں پہ وہ رہے, ان کے پاس بندوق بھی ہو, ان کے پاس بھی ہو, سب کچھ ہو. جی
Sorry, Mahmood Sahab, my mic was on. I completely agree with everything that you've said so far. I think ان کے ساتھ engage کرنے کے لیے there's a lot of mechanisms that exist. There's a lot of ways to improve the relationship between the two sides. One of the methods you've already mentioned, I would also argue, and I'm very glad, by the way, that you brought up the upcoming and pending connection that is going to be created between Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, because that level of economic integration, I think, will go a huge way towards improving the relationship between the two sides. There's also medical tourism. There's bolstering cross-border communities. There's investing in local communities to ensure there's value addition across the supply chain of what is traded across the 5 border points that are currently open between the two sides. My penultimate question to both Ile and to Dr. Zaland is, we spoke a little bit earlier about female representation, and I think that is a very, very important aspect to all this, because that female representation in Afghanistan is missing in just about every sphere, be it political or otherwise. Ubaidullah Bahir recently wrote an article for The Nation in which he spoke about how there are groups within the Afghan Taliban that are willing to have this conversation, that are willing to, look at and move more towards the opening of universities, of the government being a little more inclusive as far as female participation is concerned, and how, regional powers can sort of also influence that. And my personal feeling is that if we were able to facilitate some of these conversations, and if we were able to sort of interlocute and create space for these conversations, that would not only over the course of time improve the relationships with the government of Pakistan, but the interim Taliban government, hardliner as it might be, may be a little more amenable to some of the conversations that we're having. So my question to you, Ile, is as far as this female representation is concerned in all the negotiations that you've seen so far, do you see any kind of movement happening towards this in the mid to long term? And to Dr. Ziland, my question to you is, since it is an interim government, in your view, do you see any kind of movement towards elections, towards more representation, towards the inclusion of minority reports? And what is the role that regional powers, especially Pakistan, can play in order to facilitate some of that? Ile, if you don't mind going first.
Actually, I will start from the point where you mentioned that the request was given to Afghan government of Afghan Emirates to get TTP to the negotiation table. There was a time that Afghans were begging Pakistan government to bring Taliban negotiation table. We Afghans, it is, and it hurts a lot if it's not going to happen. If it is really in the hand of Afghan government, they should do it. But as a woman, as a who was grown up in war, and as a girl who suffered a lot in my entire life, and we have millions of women like me in Afghanistan, I want to mention a few points in the relation of Afghanistan and Pakistan. As we always say, we are two Muslim brother countries. But as I mentioned in my previous points, that I always seen an one-sided love story. So, like, it's never late. We had that 20 years where we could correct our relations, but it didn't happen. But now, is it not too late? It's not about having TTP in Pakistan and they create problems and they attack people. It's also at points by in the TAPI project and also in APTA. We both countries need each other. But again, as a woman, I would like to request Pakistan side to change the policy and to have that kind of feelings that let's live in that region like two real brothers. Like two real Muslim countries in one place. Look, when we know our priorities, and of course Pakistan knows their priority. For example, I want to give an example. If in all these 20 years, we tried to achieve Gawadar and also to import or export goods from India. It never happened properly. But meanwhile, Pakistan wants to have a way to achieve Central Asia. It's not going to happen one way. So we have to fix issues like this. For all, I have a very, very sisterly complaint from Pakistan government, because by the time India stopped giving Afghans visa, Pakistan did the same. Although in the beginning, after October 15, in a few months, they helped a lot, and they helped Afghans to go for medicine issues or also for some visa issues. It's highly appreciated. But these days, what's wrong that they are going to abandon Afghans who are in need? For example, if someone, I even contacted Mr. Mansoor Khan, the Pakistan ambassador in Afghanistan, and he didn't reply my request because we needed visa for our people. That kind of issues that has to be fixed from the both sides, from Pakistan and also from Afghanistan. If things like this happens, I'm not sure if we, both country, as a nation or as a government, we can achieve our goals, or we can live in a friendly sphere, or in a sphere where two Muslim countries have to live. So like this have to be solved, and has to be highlighted, and has to be brought out, because there are several issues that has to be solved. But we are not going to mention small things, but if we all know, and exactly we know that without that friendship and that kind of relation between Afghanistan and Pakistan, we cannot achieve any of our goals for all securities. And if we think about TAPI, for example, we have to fix that relations. So that's why, as a sister, I brought out this points to let you know that let's put a full stop in that one-sided love story, and let's jointly work together, because Afghan nation is now suffering for all the girls and the women, especially the girls who cannot go to school. They have to be helped, and this is the big of helping these girls, because if Taliban are choking our girls inside Afghanistan, so we are expecting our neighbor countries to at least open a small sphere or a small place for some Afghans who are in need. If we start from points like this, I think in the near future we can. If we keep thinking about just Pakistan's benefits, or only Afghanistan's benefit, it's not going to work that way.
Thank you, Eli. I think that's a very, very valid point about how this needs to stop being a marriage of convenience that is primarily viewed through the security lens. And I think, Dr. Judoon, you would also agree, no matter how hard we try to escape that security lens, it's very difficult for us to shut it down and move away from it, given the way the situation is unfolding. And thank you, Eli, for also highlighting the multiple pathways that do exist between Pakistan and Afghanistan to continue to improve the relationship despite the TTP issue. Dr. Zalan, your response very quickly, please. Do we have Dr. Zalan, or have we lost him?
Yeah, thank you so much. The current situation, the governance of Taliban, where they have been denying to have a permanent structure, like having a constitution for their government, inclusivity, participation, and representation, in a definition which the international community is defining what does inclusivity mean and what participation representation means for the international community. There is a vast difference from the definition of the Taliban and the international community. But one thing which is highly important, that is the instability, political instability within Pakistan. I think we need Pakistan where political parties are strengthened, where political representation is stabilized, where decisions should be made through public representation. And we need to have a neighbor as Pakistan to show that a democratic government can run the processes, they can lead the processes, and they can be an example to Afghanistan, where Afghanistan should have participatory representative government. The differences that we see in the region, specifically in Pakistan and Afghanistan, we are unfortunately living in a negative peace process or a negative peace environment. We need to adopt more peaceful cultures. We need to adopt more representative and participatory processes to stabilize in the long run, and then be bridge not only for South Asian countries and Central Asian, but for the Western and Eastern economies. Pakistan and Afghanistan can play a very vital role, and it can benefit from all those big projects like previously mentioned by Eli, sister, TAPI, CASA 1000, the Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan train, and many other ventures like the CPAC and also the One Belt, One Country. But political instability within Pakistan and having change of government, not only government, but statehood in Afghanistan, it never assists the current global development and progress, and then regional development and progress. And it really push not only Afghanistan but also Pakistan to be more unstable, to be more prone for extreme activities and instability.
Thank you, Dr. Zalan. Yes, and I completely do agree that space has to be created in order for there to be a more representative cycle within Afghanistan. Dr. Jadoon, my last question is to you, and it's a two-parter. It's something that I've also been struggling with in terms of how to phrase it and how to sort of talk about it. But clearly there are certain expectations that the government of Pakistan has with the interim Taliban government. The interim Taliban government, the IEA, also has certain risks associated with it if the TTP and the GOP do not come to some kind of an accord. Principal among them is, of course, the tightening of the noose around TTP's neck, further possibility of airstrikes, which are ill-advised by Pakistan, into Afghan soil, as well as the integration of TTP fighters into other groups that are operating inside Afghanistan that might not be terribly aligned with the interim Taliban government. So that's my first question. What are some of the risks to the IEA and therefore to the relationship between the GOP and the IEA if the TTP and the GOP cannot come to some kind of an accord? And the second part of that is what can be done to ensure that the IEA fulfills its bilateral agreements and obligations, not just with Pakistan necessarily, but its multilateral obligations. Principal among them, of course, the Doha Accord, but moving more towards some of the immovable stances that they've had over the last 15 months.
Thank you. That's, again, an excellent question. So for the Afghan government, the current stance that they have taken on maintaining a certain level of distance from and the Pakistan and TTP issue has likely been thought of. And what we're seeing is the result of their, hopefully, a rational analysis that the risks of alienating TTP apparently exceed the risks of annoying Pakistan, right? And I think this is rooted in the Taliban's desire to forge stronger links with other neighbors besides Pakistan. And they have stated so much. Links with Pakistan, it has been one of the bigger partners, but there's clearly a desire to diversify. So I think the risk that the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban government is undertaking right now is their international reputation, right? So it made these promises in the deal. We already know that they haven't really held up a lot of them, other than the fact that the TTP still exists there. We still know that they maintain links with Al-Qaeda, although these may not be as obvious as before, but Zawahiri was killed in Kabul. So I think the biggest risk for the Taliban government is that they will not be able to shift perceptions, their perceptions of them in the international arena. So whether this is because of a lack of willingness or whether it's a lack of capacity, perhaps there needs to be more clarity on this from the Afghan Taliban, right? So for example, the Afghan government does has enough capacity to tackle ISK on its own, but then we see on the ground that ISK continues to launch brutal attacks and is very aggressive in its propaganda campaign and its recruitment, and it's also targeting neighboring governments. So the risk there for the Afghan Taliban government is that it will not be able to shift perceptions of it either being a passive or an active sponsor of terrorism. In terms of what we can do to sort of compel the Taliban government to uphold its side of the deal, with an unconditional withdrawal from the Afghanistan, obviously by the US, actually leaves really little leverage to compel the Taliban to do anything, right? When we had, when the international community had some presence there, including civil society actors, there was still various ways to influence the local population, but also elements within the Taliban. Now, with the complete withdrawal, and given that there are other actors which are willing to engage with the Taliban, such as Russia and China, I'm not sure if the Taliban government can externally be incentivized to do this. I think the incentives need to come from within. And I think the more they engage with external actors and they realize what they need to portray externally, to attract the investment that they need, to attract the resources that they need, and probably the CT support that they will need. I think those are the mechanisms through which we may see the Taliban actually shift some of their policies.
Thank you, Dr. Jadoon. Leverage is a word that I think has come up multiple times during this conversation. And I think that's one of the key things to sort of focus on, because the existence, the perceived existence, or the lack of leverage is actually a big factor in all of this, this very sort of complicated, convoluted issue that we've been discussing for the last hour and 11 minutes. My sincerest thanks to my panelists. I almost feel like we've barely scratched the surface, and this one policy roundtable could actually have been 4 separate roundtables, each discussing one of the various aspects that we've covered so far, and perhaps we'll do that in the near future. But I do want to sincerely thank Mahmood Jan Babar Sahab. Please continue the good work that you're doing in the region. We will, of course, be in touch. Dr. Amra Jadoon, for your very expert analysis on the situation. Dr. Faiz Zalan, who has battled through very significant connectivity issues to be with us here today. And the lovely Ilay Irshad, who I have not seen in about 2.5 years, but I hope to see soon. My thank you to all of you, to the audience that has joined us for this particular policy roundtable. At the end, I just want to point out that if you would like to see our first response on the TTP-GOP negotiations, you can go to our website at www.tabadlab.com. And if you would like to see the latest episode of The Audit, which is a Pakistan-US relation podcast that Tabadlab launched this year, the 3rd episode is out, as well as a special episode on floods, and you can see that pretty much everywhere that you can stream podcasts. So thank you again, once again, to my this very august gathering and for the robust discussion. I appreciate it. Please do take care of yourselves. We'll be in touch soon. And to the audience, we will see you on the next one. Take care, and Khuda Hafiz.
Thank you.